I'm Rachel, back with my cat Leia, and here for a sudden video. Earlier today I was watching Try a Story Tag, a video put out by Jen Campbell. Jen is an avid booktuber, reader, and writer in the UK, and she wanted to put a focus on short stories. Her tag requires participants to pick up 5 unread short story collections that they own, read the first short story of each, and then make decisions about where to go from there. Since it's my birthday and I have a short story out on submission, I figured I should join her in celebrating this writing form. Plus, I need to get some reading done. None of these short story collections are even on my already long Goodreads TBR. So I'm going to start with the Best American Short Stories of the Century, as curated by John Updike. I got this during my binge buying days of the Borders bookstore's decline, I believe. From the back. Since the series' inception in 1915, the annual volumes of the Best American Short Stories have launched the literary careers, showcased the most compelling stories of each year, and confirmed for all time the significance of the short story in our national literature. Now, the Best American Short Stories of the Century brings together the best 56 extraordinary stories that represent a century's worth of unsurpassed accomplishments in this quintessentially American literary genre. I feel like that's a little bit arrogant, but I do love this this series of short stories, so I'll go with it. This expanded edition includes a new story from the Best American Short Stories 1999 to round out the century, as well as an index including every story published in the series. Well, it's a chunker, and I've balked at reading it. I've had the idea of going through 10 at a time for a YouTube series I'm doing on literary magazines. I'll link to my first video below. But everything is always less scary once you crack the book open. Speaking of scary, my next pick is The Complete Stories of Flannery O'Connor. I got this in December when my family and I were visiting a cousin and his wife in New York. I dragged the crowd to the Strand bookstore, and my mom was like, "Okay, everyone, let's be in and out of here in 30 minutes. And I'm like, "What? I need at least 3 hours, Mom." But no can do. Plus, I was in no way prepared for the shopping experience. I just vaguely knew that the Strand carried used books, and I wanted one so I'd know where it came from. So I started racing through the stacks, desperately racking my brain for classical authors, and I'm like, aha, Flannery O'Connor! This book is a 1972 edition from FSG. I only ever remember studying A Good Man is Hard to Find in school, her short story where an insufferable family is murdered on a road trip. I've kind of been planning to read this during NaNoWriMo, when I'll be working on interconnected short stories, which are in part about family violence. I don't know, it might be overkill. Eesh, puns. I got my third collection from the New York trip as well, The New York Stories of Elizabeth Hardwick. We were at NYPL, and I wanted a local souvenir. From the back. Elizabeth Hardwick was one of America's great post-war women of letters, celebrated as a novelist and as an essayist. Until now, however, her slim but remarkable achievement as a writer of short stories has remained largely hidden, with her work tucked away in the pages of periodicals, such as the Parisian Review, The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books, which she co-founded, in which it originally appeared. This first collection of Hardwick's short fiction reveals her brilliance as a stylist and as an observer of contemporary life. A young woman returns from New York to her childhood Kentucky home and discovers the world of difference within her. A girl's boyfriend is not quite good enough, his silvery eyes, light and cool, revealing nothing except pure possibility like a coin in hand. A magazine editor's life falls strangely to pieces after she loses both her husband and her job. Individual lives and the life of New York, the setting or backdrop for most of these stories, are strikingly and memorably depicted in Hardwick's beautiful and razor-sharp prose. I had no plans about when I'd read this collection, so now we'll see. In the same vein of having no idea when I'd read it, here is Get a Grip by Kathy Flann. I purchased this at the Gaithersburg Book Festival in May because she's a Baltimore writer, the city I was born in and grew up right outside of. From the back. The stories in Get a Grip depict a range of imagined lives, There are Estonian brothers trekking from their blighted neighborhood to a college interview. There's a TV meteorite hunter in town to search for otherworldly treasure. We meet a widow addicted to physical pain and a successful ad executive who loses all his worldly possessions in one day. All of the characters work out their struggles in a partly real and partly imagined Baltimore, channeling in turns the area's charm, its despair, its humor, its self-doubt, its compassion. Get a Grip is a book about who we are when the cameras are off and the phone has died. More incentive to read this quickly. She signed it for me. So nice. And finally, I have Scenes from a Village Life by Israeli author Amos Oz. I purchased this at the library book sale at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. From the side, strange things are happening in Tel Elan, a century-old pioneer village. A disgruntled retired politician complains to his daughter that he hears the sound of digging at night. Could it be their tenant, that young Arab? But then the young Arab hears the digging sounds too. And where has the mayor's wife gone, vanished without a trace, her note saying, "Don't worry about me"? Around the village, the veneer of new wealth, gourmet restaurants, art galleries, a winery, barely conceals the scars of war and of past generations. Disused air raid shelters, rusting farm tools, and trucks left wherever they stopped. Scenes from a Village Life is a memorable novel in stories by the inimitable Amos Oz, a brilliant, unsettling glimpse of what goes on beneath the surface of everyday life. I recently finished Oz's short story collection Between Friends for my book club. Seems like the book settings are relatively similar, so I figured I'd put this off for a while. Then again, I appreciate a fellow writer who blurs the distinction between short story and novel. And I've enjoyed his other work. Earlier this year, I also read his memoir, so I definitely want to get to this, eventually. Okay, so reading the first short story from each collection. I'll report back. Okay, so I'm catless, but I'm back. And I realized that when I filmed last a few hours ago, the glare might have gotten in the way of some of the pictures of the books, so I'll try to hold them closer to the camera this time. So once again, I'll start with The Best American Short Stories of the Century, as edited by John Updike. The first story was Zelig by Benjamin Rosenblatt. So we're starting with my own ethnicity, Ashkenazi, aka Eastern European Jews. This story was first published in the Bellman in 1915. The United States in part has always hinged on the question of immigrants and outsiders, and that was definitely my people 100 years ago. Many Jews lived in American tenements, worried about escalating anti-Semitic violence back in the old country, and here they worried about assimilating and losing their culture. All of these questions come to pass in the tale of Zelig, a man who isn't even all that identified with his community, except for the stereotypical way in that he's miserly with money. His financial decisions obviously lead to familial drama. I found the writing a little clunky, but the story was very short. I wonder what Rosenblatt would think of the U.S. today and the Jewish trajectory in this country. It's almost like he's a ghost. In the back of the book, it identifies his birth year as 1880, but they don't know when he died. He immigrated from Russia when he was 10, was first published in a Yiddish magazine when he was 17, and he worked as an insurance agent. So here's the cover of the Flannery O'Connor. The first story in this collection is The Geranium. It's a story about an old man called Old Dudley who moved up from the South to live with his daughter in a New York apartment. The geranium, which he spies on from a window across the alley, is supposed to be his connection to nature and the life that he knew, so I think. There's a bit of jargon here, and you have to take your time reading it to get to the full cadence of the story. Old Dudley is also a product of his time in that he is racist and doesn't react well when a black man moves in next door. This story was first published in 1946 in Accent, a quarterly of new literature, according to Wikipedia. I'd assumed the piece was meant to be contemporary. Luckily, I'm okay reading unlikable protagonists, so long as the piece is engaging. I'm officially less intimidated by Flannery O'Connor. And here's Elizabeth Hardwick's New York stories. The first one in the collection is called The Temptation of Dr. Hoffman. I'm disappointed to say this one didn't really grab me much. It's a first-person narrator, which is always dicey for me, but more importantly, I found the narrative to be stuffy and pontificating. The protagonist, also new to New York, it's a theme I see, befriends Dr. Hoffman. Subjects circle around their Protestant theology and schisms in the Hoffman's German-American family right after the fall of the Third Reich. Hardwick is obviously trying to ask big and meaningful questions, but I couldn't really get all that invested. I think ultimately I'll give this another go, but my impression right now is meh. Here's the Kathy Flan cover and the Kathy Flan signature. The first story in this one was called Neuropathy. I found it very thought-provoking. Maybe I'm overthinking this connection, I usually do, but the protagonist has a bad arm that doesn't communicate with her brain after a big accident, and she herself is having trouble communicating in her life. She watches the shopping network out of religious conviction and justifies outlandish purchases and other actions by pulling out other random biblical quotes. She's also trying to get closer to her son, who is increasingly put off by her erratic behavior. There's a lot about disabilities in this story, too. The protagonist wants to make a difference with veterans, she herself has a disability, and her son's fiancé is in a wheelchair after a car accident. Maybe the second-person narration put me more in this woman's skin than I anticipated that it would. I liked it. It was a nice take on contemporary human issues. And finally, we have Scenes from a Village Life by Amos Oz. The first story in here is called Heirs. Well, it certainly reads as a short story and not as a chapter 1. In fact, this story has 5 separate chapters inside of it. We follow Aryeh Zelnick, a man from Haifa who moves in with his ailing mother after his relationships with his wife and children fall apart. He's visited by a wolf Matzir, a fast-talking swindler-type character who claims a distant familial relationship. He's looking to take possession of Aryeh's mother's land in the village of Tel Elan, which is apparently worth a lot of money. I felt bad for the confused mother most of all, who was hardly even in the story. I wonder if or how these characters will appear in the subsequent stories. So I found this exercise to be a little difficult. I read more quickly than I usually do, and I tend to judge collections as a whole, not just by one story in them. I still intend to read all of these, even Hardwick. Probably Flan is speaking to me most right now because her stories are close to my home and time period, but from a very different perspective. Sooner or later, I'll probably have reviews of all of these up on Goodreads. I'll leave all pertinent links in the description box below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.